Are you using Linux as your main operating system on your laptop or desktop? Or maybe you just want to install Docker and use it on a Linux server in the cloud or on a Linux VM? Then this is the video for you. We're going to go through all the Linux features that you need to make sure are set up correctly so that you can get through this course and do all of the examples and code stuff. So first off, congratulations. If you're going to use Linux, it's actually the easiest to get started with Docker. Docker was made for Linux. It now actually has Docker containers for Windows, but we're going to get to that later in the course. But most of this course is all about containers on Linux. And so when you think of the Mac and the Windows stuff, it's mostly them actually running a tiny little Linux VM in the background. For you, if you're going to be running natively on Linux, then you're good to go. There is no emulation or little VM running in the background. It just runs straight on your operating system. So there's three main ways to get Docker on Linux, and it might not be what you expect. The first one is through a script. That's actually using a curl script. It's actually my preferred way, especially when I'm installing it from just for testing or playing around with it, because it does use the edge releases, which are not the stable sort of production-y version. They're more of the beta monthly releases. So obviously you don't want to do that for maybe a production system where you want to automate over and over again for creating servers in the cloud or your data center. But for installing locally, I highly recommend just using Edge. It's actually quite stable for being beta. I usually don't have any issues with it. But it allows you to test out features quicker because it comes out monthly. So that script would actually get you installed, and we're going to be using that script today. I'm also going to show you, though, about the store, which has specific instructions for each distribution. So whether you're on Ubuntu or Debian or Red Hat or CentOS or just like all of the different distributions, they largely come down to Debian-based distributions or Fedora and Red Hat-based distributions, and the Yum package manager and the apt package manager, right? So there are other variants and other things out there, but really in this course for Linux, we're really just mostly talking about those two because they cover 95% of the use cases in Linux. And you need to go to the store to get the specific instructions for your distribution, because you'll learn that you shouldn't be using the built-in default one that might come with your package manager. We'll talk about that in a second. So I want to note real quick, though, if you're on Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or RHEL, as I'll call it from now on, that only really officially supports Docker Enterprise Edition, which is the paid version. And Docker's attitude really is a paid operating system gets a paid version of Docker. A free operating system gets a free version of Docker. When we're talking about the native stuff like Linux, right? So in this case, if you're going to be on Red Hat, you can actually go to the store and look up the CentOS version because it's also a Yum package manager version, and you can do that Docker CE instead of having to go pay for Docker EE. But I just want to tell you that now, because if you go to the store and then you go to click on Docker CE and then you go look for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, it's not going to be there because it's over on the EE side. Docker assumes if you're running the paid RHEL that you would actually be paying for Docker support, just like you pay for your Linux support. So next up, you can install this on any Linux option, whether that's the native computer on your laptop or desktop with a GUI, or it's a server in the cloud. All these processes are the same, and we will, if there's ever an exception, I will mention it at the time. This is not going to work for all distributions. Remember how I said 95% is really what we're going for. So that's just an estimate of my experience with the people I work with. I have no scientific background on that 95%. But there are distributions out there that may not work or will not work with Docker. And specifically, those are the less common or vendor-specific distributions like Amazon Linux or Linode Linux or a few other ones out there, maybe like Google Cloud's Linux, which I know is still beta testing Docker support. So Docker is a leading-edge technology that uses the OS kernel and specific features in that kernel, and those particular kernels, at least in the past, have not had all the features in them that Docker needs to work properly. So just for this course, a lot of my stuff is going to be on, like my demonstrations and stuff are going to be on a Ubuntu or a Debian variant. And actually in this one, we're going to use Mint here in a minute. And lastly, don't use the pre-installed setups. This is generally my recommendation because Docker moves really fast and you want the latest version of Docker. Even if you're doing production, you want the latest production version when you start out. And so if you go to DigitalOcean or AWS or Linode, you might find a Linux install that's maybe like an easier built-in package thing that just says, hey, we've already got Docker installed for you. Generally, I don't recommend using those because you're usually going to get an old version. You're going to get an old version of Docker, and then the first thing you're going to have to do is figure out how to update it. And depending on how they installed Docker, it may not be that easy to figure out how to update it to the latest edition. So I always recommend using like the official Ubuntu or the official Fedora or the official CentOS installs, then manually installing Docker as we will in a minute. In general, this is going to actually go through a couple of basic steps. We're going to first update our package manager and install Docker. Then we're going to optionally add your user account to the Docker group, and that'll prevent you from having to use sudo every single time you want to run a Docker command because that can add a little bit of time and tediousness to it. So we're going to do that. Then we're going to go and we're going to clone my repo from GitHub onto your Linux machine, and then we can talk about getting a code editor if you don't have one. And lastly, we're going to tweak your terminal and shell setup. This is a very optional approach, but I get a lot of questions in the course from people saying, hey, your terminal or your shell did this or looked like this. How do you do that? So I'm trying to give some information around paths you can go down to maybe tweak and set up your shell differently so that it looks more like the one that I use, which I use every day, and I customize it constantly because I'm trying to optimize it. You don't have to do any of that if you don't want to, but I'm going to give you some tips on that. Okay, so what I have here is a Mint Linux stock out-of-the-box machine. And Mint Linux is a variant of Ubuntu, so in case you're curious, it's actually a really great desktop version of Linux, but I'm sure at this point you are using your own Linux and you have all the things you want on it, and so I don't need to tell you about the one that I tend to like. So if I just type Docker in this scenario, it actually says, hey, it's not installed. You can use apt to install it, and you install with docker.io. The problem with that is you're going to get an old version, maybe even a year old, which is that's at least 4 major versions, if not 12 edge minor versions old. So you don't want that. You actually want to install it through the store. And so we're going to actually use a script like I mentioned a while ago. But before we do that, I just want to show you what it looks like if I go into Docker CE. I know that basically my Mint is actually just a variant of Ubuntu. So I can scroll down and find the Ubuntu one. And it actually will step through instructions. It tells you which editions, and I know mine is based on 1604. So I click on the usage instructions in the top right, and it actually walks me through, and it actually tells me, hey, you can use, make sure it's these versions, and go get the Docker for Ubuntu from the Docker documentation website, which is a very detailed, stepping you through making sure that you don't have the old version installed from the default apt-get repository and how to go through each step by step. However, there is sort of a cheat for this. In our case, when we want to install the Edge release, I'm just going to go to get.docker.com, and it's actually going to show me a script which I can use with curl over HTTPS, so that way I'm making sure that it's officially the script from Docker because it's encrypted on the connection. And it will let me install through an automated way. It'll basically figure out what is my operating system, what is my kernel, how do I use apt package or yum package, and it'll figure all that stuff out and basically install everything I need. So I tend to use this because it works so well for local installs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this and paste it into my terminal. And it's going to download the script, and it's telling me just to run the shell. So put in my admin sudo password, and away we go. And you'll notice while this is installing that the actual package is docker-ce. And over the last few years, as Docker has changed their branding and their versioning and also their packaging formats, the name of the actual package that you would install has changed. And so the one that it actually installed in the background is called docker-ce, in case you're curious. Okay, and it's actually telling us at the end of the install that if we would like for our user account to be able to just run Docker commands without having to type sudo or go in as actual root, then we can do this particular command where we're just adding our user account to the Docker group on our system. And then I'm going to need to log out and back in order for that change to take effect. So instead of doing that, I'm just wanting to test to make sure that Docker is working and running. And I can do a sudo docker version. Okay, great. I'll actually log out and log back in a minute. So you don't have to do that part if you're concerned about security. And here's why. Docker requires root in order to do the things it needs to do with the core functionality of Linux. And those things are something around namespaces, and there's this thing called C groups and other features of Linux that it needs to use. So it needs root for that, right? So by default, when you do things, it's going to need to use sudo. But if you add your user to the Docker group, what you're effectively doing is giving that user, in this case, Brett, the ability to actually run a Docker container later that could then have root permissions on the host. Now, this is a subtle little nuance of security that you don't necessarily have to worry about if it's just your local machine. But there are some variants of Linux that have taken a hard stance on this, and that includes all the Red Hat. So the CentOS and the Red Hat Enterprise Linux and maybe the Fedora will not work with this Docker option. You will have to either be root or use sudo for every command you use for Docker on those distributions of Linux, unfortunately. Again, that's anything based on the Red Hat Enterprise Linux stuff and Fedora, and that's Fedora, RHEL, and CentOS. There might be others, but those are the ones I definitely know about that won't work with this. So in those cases, even if you add yourself to the Docker group, it will do nothing, and you'll still have to type sudo. And you'll know if it doesn't work because if you just type Docker version, it'll actually say, hey, I can't talk to the Linux daemon. Can you help me out? And that's because only root can talk to that socket. And so that's a hint that you need to be either admin, root rather, or be in a group that works. So notice if I do Docker version again with the sudo, it works, right? All right, now that you have Docker installed, you're going to need two other tools for this course from Docker. But when you're using Linux as your main operating system, they don't come bundled with the install. When you're on Mac or Windows, this is all managed for you, but on Linux, we have to take things into our own hands a little bit. And those two tools are Docker Machine and Docker Compose. Each one is a single binary, and you can get them on Docker's website in the documentation area, not on the store. And so for the Docker Machine part, I can find here instructions for Linux, and I can just copy that, and it should work on my machine. Okay, and now I can type Docker Machine version and make sure that I got the latest version and it works. And I can do the same thing for Docker Compose and find that on the documentation website as well. And scroll down to the Linux option. Now, we could actually copy this and install it from here, but I want to show you an alternative way that I actually prefer. The nice thing here is that the Docker website has lots of information about how to install it, what it does, and whatnot. But these are all available on GitHub, so I can go over to github.com/docker/compose and click on the releases button. And this is where the official release, as you can see, the latest is 1.15. And so in this case, the documentation website is a little outdated with 1.14 than the releases on the Compose on GitHub. So I just always remember to go check github.com/docker/compose/releases, and I can do the same thing for machine. And right here, it gives me the information that I just need to cut and paste into my terminal. But you'll notice that I actually got a permission denied error. And that's because in this case, I do need to be root. So I'm going to be sudo-i for interactive, and then I'm going to paste that same information. And then I should be able to back out of root and type docker compose version. And there we go. In case you're curious, back over on the GitHub, I can actually just replace that word compose with machine and end up right over on the machine page and the releases for Docker Machine. Notice this is on 12.2. And I can copy this stuff here as well and install it that way instead of the documentation website way. So the choice is up to you. There's not really much information about installation on the GitHub. The much more information is over on the documentation site for Docker. That is docs.docker.com. And the one last piece of information here is that because we manually installed these, that also means that Compose and Machine we have to manually update. So you just need to make it a part of your sort of mental checklist every month or two to probably go check for new versions of Compose and Machine because they do update pretty frequently. Hopefully in the future, Docker will add packages to the package managers for these so that we can automatically update them with the rest of our system just like we do for the Docker install. Okay, so let's go get my repo. Now there's several ways you can do this. One way on GitHub is that you simply download their GUI and use it, but they don't actually have an official one for Linux yet. So you would need to go get a different third-party one, and we're not going to really talk about that. So we're just going to use the command line. So if you're looking at my repo page under my GitHub account, you'll find that link in the resource section under section 1 under the Getting Resources lecture. And over here, you can just copy this URL and paste it in the command line. But if you've never used Git before, then you won't have that installed. So if I typed Git, it would not be there. So I do need to install Git real quick. Okay, so now I should have the version. Yep, okay, I got Git installed. And now I'm just going to make a directory real quick to put this repo in. And so I do git clone, and then I paste in that URL that I got from the web page. And that will pull down my repo. Now, you could download a zip file of my repo, but it does get updated as I fix things or make things better. And so it's easier when you're starting this course, maybe a month later, if you're still doing the course, that you just need to do a git inside the directory, actually. So inside the Udemy Docker Mastery directory, I could just do a git pull, and that would get the latest updates for the course. All right, next we want to talk about code editors. I personally like Visual Studio Code. It's very similar to GitHub's Atom if you've ever used that, or Sublime Text if you've ever used that. Obviously, if you're a Vim fan or Emacs or any of the other editors, you can use all those. But I will be showing off a little bit of Visual Studio Code in this course because it has a really great Docker add-on. So I'm going to download the Debian version. And on my version of Linux, it actually will automatically open with the package installer, and I can install it that way. Okay, and it's finished installing. And now I can run it. And once you get Visual Studio Code running, or just Code as we call it, or VS Code, I guess it's got lots of names there, you might want to go into the extensions and look for Docker. And the one that's just called Docker, install that. And that will allow syntax highlighting and little extra features whenever you're editing the Docker files in this course. And a nice feature there is if you're in a directory and you just type code with a dot after it, it'll actually open Visual Studio Code in that directory. So it's sort of a shortcut to get all the files from my course up in your Visual Studio Code. Okay, and the last little tip we're going to talk about real quick is customizing your terminal. And the nice thing is on Linux is everything is pretty great out of the box. You have a nice looking terminal usually that comes with Linux. It works with all the features of Docker. And one of the things you'll notice is the command line completion. That's tab completion that you may have used for a long time, where if you're typing a command in Linux in your shell and you just hit the tab key, it'll auto finish that and actually show you features around the options for that command. So if I just type Docker and then hit tab twice, it'll actually show me all the different commands I can use here. So I could type Docker image and then hit tab twice again. It gives me another one, and I could say ls, And then I could hit tab twice again, and it would give me all the options that I would have for that particular command. And that all works out of the box after installing. You don't have to do anything to get that feature. With Mac and Windows, you have to go through extra steps in case you watch those videos. But in case you're seeing stuff in my course, like the fact that I use the ZSH shell, and then maybe I have different colors that you like or features, you just need to check out www.brettfisher.com/shell. And I list everything that I use in my custom shell in Mac that will actually work pretty easily inside Linux. So I customize my Vim, for example, and other various things of my shell. So feel free to check that out, but it's absolutely not required for this course. I just get a lot of questions on it, so I wanted to give you some more info before we get started. Okay, so hopefully you have Docker working on your machine. So let's just review the tips and tricks that we just talked about and all the things we got installed. So after installing Docker, make sure you also get Compose and Machine, and you can get them from those two links or from the GitHub page that I showed you. I didn't mention this earlier, but later in the course, when we get to the sections on Swarm, you'll be using Docker Machine to create more VMs, whether on your machine or in the cloud, that run Docker so that you can have multiple nodes running Docker. Docker Machine is just one of the ways that you can actually set up another machine to run Docker. And you can check that out anytime, but you won't need it till near the end of the course. And if you'll remember, we talked about Visual Studio Code, so you can check that out. And bonus, if you're on Linux, then bash completion for the commands just works, and you don't have to worry about it.